Welcome, welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here we are. So we now have in these last few verses a rationale being provided for why we're asked to do these particular things and to, I would say, sanctify ourselves, distinguish ourselves in these particular ways that have just been described. So, Ki ani Hashem, for I Hashem, I the Lord, Hama'aleh, who bring you up, Etchem, bring you up, Me'eretz Mitzrayim, from the land of Egypt, Liot lachem l'Elohim, to serve as an Elohim, as a God for you, to be your God. V'yitem kadoshim, you shall be holy, ki kadosh ani, for I am holy, for I am kadosh. So if, in fact, we make God our Elohim, then we become kadosh. It's a way of identifying and associating with God in such a way that it affects our very nature, our very existence. Ki ani Hashem hamaleh. So we'll see what Rashi has to say. For I, the Lord, who bring you up, who raise you, etchem, almanat, for the sake. In other words, this is being done is for the reason why God brought us out of Egypt. Shetikablu mitzvotai, so that you should accept my commands. Heleti etchem, I brought you up. In other words, that's the very reason for having been rescued from the land of Egypt. And before I go on to Rashi's alternative explanation, I want to just underscore the idea that accepting mitzvot, right, is a way of overcoming our own impulses and being able to conquer those parts of us that can lead to addiction and to self-destruction. And that in fact is a training in being willing to go against perhaps our own natures, which is in some ways the Pharaoh inside of us when it asks us to do self-destructive behaviors. That this is part of what the mitzvot do that allow us to become kadosh. So another interpretation, davar acher. Ki ani Hashem, for I, the Lord, Hama'alechem, right, who bring you up. And the commentary is, Bekulan ketiv hotseti. In other words, the fact that it uses a different verb here for what God did to the Israelites in bringing them out of Egypt. Because normally it says v'hotseti, which means I brought you out. But here it says Hama'aleh, who bring you up. V'chan ketiv, Hama'ala, right? Right. So here it talks about Hama'aleh, who brings you up. Tana Debe Rabbi Ishmael was taught in the school of Rabbi Ishmael. Ilmale lo heleti et Israel, were it not for the fact that I brought the children of Israel up from Egypt, Mitzrayim, Ela Bishvil, right? It was only for the fact she'ein to sorry, mitamin bishratzim. In other words, were it only for the fact that I brought the Jewish people up from Egypt so that they would not defile themselves through these shratzim, right, through these crawling creatures. Kisha'ar umot, just like the other nations, dayam. It's like dayenu, right? It should have been sufficient. In other words, if the only reason God had rescued the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt was to be able to command them not to defile themselves through the consumption and association with these creatures that are considered tameh, it would have been a good enough reason. Would have been a good enough reason. Umaliyutahu gabayhu. And in fact, the fact that they're not to defile themselves in this way is an act of perfection on their part. V'hu lashon ma'ala, and this is the connotation of the expression ma'aleh. Ma'ala can be, as Jastrow says, refers to superiority. That is something that gives a level of superiority to the Jewish people. So, interesting, right? Going on. Zot Torah HaBehema. This is the teaching regarding HaBehema, that is, of course, domesticated animals, V'ha'of, and birds, fowl, V'chol Nefesh Chaya, and all living creatures, Haromeset B'mayim, which swarm or in the seas, Ulechol nefesh, and to all living creatures, hashoretzet al haaretz, which crawl on the earth. Going here. So there's no Rashi on that. Lahavdil bein hatamei uvein hatom, or to be able to make a distinction between that which is impure and that which is pure. Uvein hachaya hanechelet, and between beasts that can be consumed, uvein hachaya asher lo te'achel, and those beasts which shall not be eaten. Lahavdil, to make a distinction. Lo bilvad, it is not sufficient. Hashoneh, one who recites these passages, recites these particular laws. Ela shetehe yodea, but a person needs to know, umakir, and recognize, ubaki bahem, and to be an expert regarding this particular subject. Bein hatameh uvein hatohor, between that which is impure and that which is pure. Tzarich lomar, okay, that what we have to say, what is bein chamor lepara, right, between a donkey from a cow, right, v'halokfar meforashim heim, right, but the fact is that already explained, it's already been told as to what is okay and what isn't okay, right? Ella bein tme'ah lacha. So in other words, we have to be able to, it's not just a question, I think, here, it's a little bit opaque, all right? Because I believe that tzaddik lamar is tzarich lomar, right? One would have to say between, or maybe one would think, right? Let's just keep going. But we have to make sure that we can make the distinction between one which is impure to you, the tohora lacha, and one which is pure for you. In other words, what he's talking about is bein nishchat chetzio, in other words, shel kaneh, one whose windpipe was half severed, the nishchat rovo, from one whose windpipe was most of it was severed. In other words, to be able to make the distinction that even though a cow, in other words, it's not just the fact that we know that donkeys are never going to be permissible, they're always going to be tameh, but we even would have to be able to distinction from a cow, which is permissible, but if it's not properly slaughtered, in other words, if the windpipe was only severed a little bit, right, half of it, then that's not considered to be properly slaughtered, and that would also be tameh. In other words, the ability to make those kinds of distinctions. Uvein hachaya hanechelet, and between animals which can be eaten, can be consumed. Tzarich lomar, right? Bein tzvi le'arod. In other words, one for sure, right? It is between a deer and a wild ass. The deer is an ungulate. So it has cloven hoofs that chews the cud. It's a permissible animal. Arud is a wild ass, and of course it doesn't have split hooves, and so it certainly is never permissible. V'halok far meforashim heim, And it says, but that's already, you've already been told, right? We were given a listing of animals that are permissible and which aren't. So the question is, what's it adding here, right? Just as in the last comment we had, Ela bein shen noldu ba simanei trefa. So again, I believe we're talking here about a tzvi, a deer, and if it was born with certain indications that it is treif, right, that it is not a whole animal, that somehow it is torn, simanei treira kshera, that refer to, even though there are indications that it is trefa, nevertheless, there are certain kinds of indications like that that don't render the animal non-consumable. The nildor ba simanei trefa psula, as opposed to one that is born with these indications of it being torn, that would render it pasul, that is inappropriate, undone, no, not to be, excuse me, not to be consumed. So, in other words, this particular here, this last sentence is saying that we have to have the level of expertise where we can make a distinction, very even subtle distinctions that would allow us to eat it or not. And with this, we come to the end of the Rashis of Parshat Shmini. So I'm going to stop the share and allow you to maybe make some comments, if you will, on this. So, any general thoughts about this particular subject?
Are you
Yeah,
talking
Harlan.
about the kosher foods like
For some reason,
we can only
I'm not
eat
hearing you, Harlan. I don't know if your volume is turned down the whole way.
We can hear. I can hear Harlan fine.
So I can also see
Could
if
you hear
anybody
me?
else. Kathy, you want to see if I can hear you?
I can hear you, Harlan.
Okay, good. I was just
So wait a
wondering.
Are you
minute.
saying something? Because I can't hear
Can you
anything.
hear me?
Okay.
You
So
can't
there's
hear any
something
of
wrong
us.
with my volume that I'm not able to listen. I'm not able to hear anything. And I
Hmm.
do have it turned up.
Wow.
Okay. Yes. David, I saw your comment. I don't know why I can't hear it.
Could
Okay.
you hear
All
me?
right. Well, let me stop the recording and I'm going to try and get back in the room and see if I can hear what you have to say. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah, shut it down.